So, back in March, I visited Frederick, Oklahoma. This was my first visit to Frederick, but I did know some people from Frederick when I was in college, so shout out to all of you if you're watching this video. I hope you're doing well. And so the main attraction that I wanted to see on this trip to Frederick was the Abernathy brothers, sometimes called Abernathy boys. The statue of the Abernathy boys on the South Courthouse lawn. So this statue shows Lewis, sometimes spelled Louis, also known as Bud Abernathy, the older brother, and his younger brother, Temple, sometimes shortened as Temp Abernathy. So we have Bud and Temple. They were two boys who grew up on a ranch in Tillman County back in the early 1900s. And they became famous for taking a series of trips across the country by themselves. Frederick is considered the starting point for their first trip. Thus, this statue was set up here around the time of the Oklahoma Centennial. Now, they took that first trip when Bud was 9 and Temple was only 5. They traveled on horseback from Frederick, Oklahoma to Santa Fe, New Mexico, and back, without parental supervision. Now, I wouldn't blame anyone in our modern audience for wondering what the heck kind of parent gives the kids permission to travel by themselves like that. Well, their mom passed away, so she wasn't around to give any objections. Now, the boy's father, his name was Jack Abernathy, and he was actually fairly well known and famous at the time. He was also, I guess you might call him, one of the original free-range parents. But his background, he had been a cowboy, kind of been on his own at a young age, and he became well known as a wolf hunter for hunting wolves. He would catch wolves and sell them to traveling shows, circuses, things like that. And he knew some technique where he could hold the wolf's jaw in place so it couldn't bite down on him. And that's how he would subdue them. That's also why his hunting moniker was Jack Catch 'em Alive Abernathy. And his successes at catching wolves actually caught the attention of then President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt actually visited Frederick in 1905 to do a wolf hunt, and Jack Abernathy, the boy's father, he served as Roosevelt's tour guide. After this, Roosevelt appointed him as a U.S. Marshal, where he continued to live up to the moniker Catch 'em Alive. And it was his association with Roosevelt that partly inspired the boys' next trip. In 1910, Roosevelt was no longer the president, and he had gone traveling overseas. He would return from his long overseas tour in June 1910, and these boys came up with the idea, hey, why don't we travel to New York City by horseback to greet Roosevelt when he returns and say hello. So they asked their dad if they could do this, and he said, okay. Now, any father who'd let kids their age do something like that today is probably at risk of losing his job, losing his custody of the children, and losing his freedom. But you just kind of chalk it up to times were different back then. By all accounts, from what I've read and seen researching this video, these kids were very well received on their journey to New York. This second trip of theirs generated a lot of publicity. People knew about them, heard about them, and the vast majority of Americans were impressed, not appalled. Impressed, not appalled. These young brothers did make it to New York. They met Roosevelt, and they even marched in a parade. And for the journey home, they actually shipped their horses back to Oklahoma via train, and they bought a car, a Brush Runabout. It was a car company back then called Brush Motor Car Company, and later Brush Runabout Company. They bought one of those cars, and they drove it home to Frederick. I guess back then you didn't have all the laws with having a license and insurance and all that. And apparently for the trip home, one of the boys played the role of driver and the other played the role of mechanic. Kind of like those characters in that old movie 2-Lane Blacktop. So that cross-country trip to New York and back made these kids very famous. It sounds like, from what I gather, back then, if you were in the U.S., you would have heard of the Abernathy boys. After that big trip, what do you do for the next trip? Well, some promoter contacted them and offered them a prize. $10,000 to ride from New York to the Pacific coast by horseback within 60 days. So in 1911, when Bud would have been 11 and Temple would have been about 7, they took this trip. According to one source I read, the starting point was Coney Island in New York City, and the ending destination was San Francisco. I'd like to be able to tell you they made it within the 60 days and won the $10,000, but they didn't. They got there in 62 days, 2 days behind schedule. But reportedly, this is still a record for fastest journey across the United States on horseback like that. So I guess you could say these kids were like kind of the original cannonballers. You know, the cannonball, except the cannonball is an illegal cross-country road race by car. This wasn't illegal for them at the time. So, wonder if the VinWiki crowd, Ned Bullion, will ever want to do a video on these two brothers. But even though they didn't meet the conditions for getting there in 60 days, the 62 days is still a record. They could take pride in that. I don't ever see that being broken. Now, their fourth cross-country trip took place in 1913. And by this time, a few things had changed. Obviously, they were older. According to what I read about their dad, he got remarried and actually moved to Texas to work in the oil business. And this last trip doesn't seem to be quite as well documented as the trip to New York City or the cross-country journey from New York to San Francisco, but they traveled to New York City on motorcycle. And at this point, Bud was 13, Temple would have been about 9. So all of those trips were completed before the youngest of the two brothers was even a teenager. So this has been pretty interesting to learn about these two brothers, to say the least. As for their later lives, Bud went on to be a lawyer. He worked as a lawyer, and both of them ended up living and dying in Texas later in life. Bud lived until 1979, and Temple, who ended up working in the oil business, he lived until the year 1986. So it doesn't appear that anything they did after that last trip made big headlines, but the things they did at such young ages will probably never be duplicated. By the way, a quick note about the sculpture. The sculptor was Gary Dean Gardner, DDS. He was a dentist from Lawton who got into sculpting later in life. By the way, there's a nearby attraction in Frederick called the Pioneer Heritage Town Site. It was closed on the day I was there, but looks like it might be an interesting place. Thankfully, though, the Abernathy brothers statue is not behind a gate, so you can go see it. And thank you all for watching. Please click like and subscribe.